Of course, we will go into the details of the latest news, but I first want to take a general assessment from you about the Ukraine war. What is the current situation on the ground? Who has the more advantages? And what are the disadvantages that both sides have? What is the situation?
The situation in Ukraine at the moment is that the Russians are advancing. They do seem pretty close to capturing the important town and base of Pakrovsk. On the other hand, it has taken them a year to get to this position, and of course numerous casualties, because it's become a cliche, but contemporary military technology, as in the First World War, but in a new form of mines and drones, strongly favours the defensive. So the point is that Russia undoubtedly can capture more Ukrainian territory, but on the evidence so far, this will take a long time and be very costly. Now, on the other hand, as the First World War also demonstrates, you can have a stalemate lasting for years and then one side collapses. And if either side collapses, it's not going to be the Russians, because clearly the Russians have a considerable advantage in terms of sheer numbers. And of course in security of military supply, because whatever the Europeans may say, it's quite clear that Western aid to Ukraine is not entirely secure. So I think there is a motive on both sides to come to a deal, because on the Russian side you can gain more territory, but how much more territory? And while there is a chance of a Ukrainian collapse, there is absolutely no certainty. On the Ukrainian side, you will lose more territory, whatever happens, and there is a risk of complete collapse. So, and of course, up to now, you have had a situation in which the Russian advantage has not been so marked in terms of numbers, because Russia is relying on a well-paid volunteer army, whereas the Ukrainians have been conscripting very large numbers of young men. But what you now see in Ukraine is huge resistance to conscription among the population. And according to the latest independent opinion polls by Gallup, you see now a large majority of the Ukrainian population would like an early compromise peace. Not surrender, not giving up completely, but making a compromise. So I think the advantage is definitely on Russia's side at the moment.
Mm-hmm. Well, when you look at the beginning of the war in 2022, there was this Biden-era policy, not just in the United States, but the entirety of the Western world, that the main aim of the war was to get back to 1991 borders of Ukraine. But since then, of course, many things changed. But during all these years, we have seen Ukrainian leader Zelensky having certain discussions with the 1991 borders. But from what we have seen, there was no concrete strategy to get there. And in many times Zelensky visited the United States, we have seen, especially from the Republican side, they were questioning, okay, you want to get your lands back, but you don't have the means to tell us how you are going to do it. And I think that all this strategy for the 2 and 3 years is kind of ambiguous at best. What do you think the Biden era strategy was? How did they aim to get back to 1991 borders?
I don't think that they did, frankly, or at least until late in 2023, there was the hope that the Ukrainian offensive would break through and recapture at least much of the lost territory. But even then, the CIA itself was warning very strongly against helping Ukraine to reconquer Crimea, because they were afraid that that would lead to nuclear war, that the Russians would resort to nuclear weapons. But since the failure of the Ukrainian offensive in 2023, there has really been no realistic chance of Ukraine recovering it's lost territories. But the problem was, I think, that the Biden administration and Western governments had nailed themselves publicly and officially so much to this principle of territorial legitimacy that they couldn't change the policy, even when it was clear that the policy was actually dead. And you know, the then American chairman of the Joint Chiefs, General Milley, actually did say in the autumn of 2023, this is the optimal moment for Ukraine to try and do a deal. It only gets worse from now on, and of course that is pretty much what has happened.
Well, now we can get back to the recent news where there is talks of a big deal to happen between Russia and United States. And although it's not confirmed, many sources on the mainstream media in the Western world are claiming that there are certain specifics to this deal, unlike the previous talks that they had, which consists of Donbass, Ukraine withdrawing from Donbass, and the rest of the oblasts that Russia formerly annexed would be open for some sort of referendum. But when we look into a potential peace deals between two countries, it's more complex because Russia already put it on their constitution that these four oblasts would be part of the Russian Federation. So it really doesn't leave much ground for Putin to use some diplomatic maneuvers in that sense. So do you think that this type of deal would bring permanent peace to Ukraine?
Nothing in international affairs is permanent. Who can say what the world will look like in even 50 years, let alone 100? But I think there is a chance because actually Russia in this constitutional amendment never defined the borders of these provinces. So it is constitutionally open to Russia to say, yes, we provisionally we have what we hold now, and of course we still claim the whole of these oblasts, but this is open to future negotiation, and the Ukrainians say the same thing. We still claim the whole of these provinces, but we're willing to negotiate. And then probably, as in the case of Cyprus, the negotiations go on forever. I mean, hopefully, as in the case of Cyprus, unlike, for example, the case of Kashmir, though we don't go back to war again, if both sides have got enough of what they need in terms of what they see as their vital interests, and if the costs of returning to war seem too high. But of course, I mean, the thing is, this isn't only a territorial issue. And we have heard that Trump is willing to make this territorial proposal. And I think this is true, because without that, I don't think that Putin would have agreed to come to the negotiating table. What we don't know is how far Trump is willing to go in terms of really guaranteeing against future NATO expansion. Because I think the Russians will not be satisfied simply with a declaration from Trump, which a future American administration can withdraw again, because after all, that's pretty much what happened to Russia in the 1990s. No, they will want something much more formal. Now, that will mean a constitutional amendment in Ukraine, restoring neutrality to the Ukrainian constitution. And it will take a lot of pressure from Washington to get the Ukrainian parliament to agree to that. The Russians may also insist on NATO as an organization withdrawing its offer of future NATO membership to Ukraine. Now that will be desperately humiliating for NATO as an organization. It's not easy to see how the existing NATO Secretary General could remain in office, if that is the price of it. And that too would take huge pressure from Trump to bring about. So these questions are open. Then there is the Russian demand for demilitarization, which they've never defined in detail. So there's plenty of room for compromise there, but we don't know what the Russians will demand and what America, let alone Kiev, could agree to?
When you are talking about a peace deal, it always boils down to what's going on in the ground as well. So when we look into the ground, there are massive issues with manpower shortages that Ukraine is suffering from. We are seeing the conscription situation is not in a good spot either. Zelensky's been pressured into dropping the conscription age to 18, and he's been resisting so far, but we don't know for how long. So when we look into this situation, it's fair to say that Russians are making a similar assessment for the future of the Ukrainian military. So in that sense, if they are sensing that Ukraine is going to collapse militarily in the next 6 months, why would they be more positive to make concessions from their initial claims on Ukraine?
Well, apparently the Russian generals have been telling Putin that Ukraine will collapse within 6 months if Russia keeps going. But then the Russian generals have been wrong about so much, have been responsible for so many disasters since the beginning of this war, that it is very hard to see why somebody who is, after all, as intelligent and cynical as Putin would take anything that they say now on trust. And you see, when it comes to numbers, the crucial thing to remember is that Russia does not actually have such an overwhelming superiority in numbers, because Putin has never dared launch mass conscription in Russia. He is operating with, and that is a key reason why there has not been more public discontent, why you haven't seen in Russia the kind of public discontent you see in Ukraine, because the men going to the army are being very well paid. This has contributed to a real boom in the economies of the provinces from which they come. And he is not, above all, trying to conscript people from Moscow and Petersburg. Now, the question is, how many more people can Russia recruit while paying these kind of salaries? Without, of course, simply driving inflation through the roof. So the Russian economy is also a major factor to continue here, because you have had public statements by Russian economic officials warning of the danger of inflation if the war goes on. And obviously Putin is very, very conscious of Russian public opinion and the threat if Russian public opinion turns against him. So I think, there are also serious motives for Putin to seek peace, if, of course, he can get a peace that he can represent as a clear Russian victory.
From a more military perspective, we have seen Russians begin the invasion of Ukraine in 2022, which is not using a attritional warfare, but more of a maneuver warfare, which ended up in quite a disastrous ending in the beginning. And then we have seen that their warfighting principles has been changed to more akin to Soviet Union type of fighting, which using insane amount of firepower, using artillery, and pushing slowly rather than at once. And we have seen in the last 2 and 3 years, they lost so many armored vehicles that the entire military is demechanized at this point. So, and I think that going by disaster, I think Russian army would still want to get one good victory, like not an attrition warfare, but from a strategic point, making difference in the ground, not by numbers, but by some sort of tactical brilliance. Do you think that Russians are capable, if the problems in the Ukraine army continues, of course, do you think that Russians are capable of putting one decisive victory in the ground and changing the warfare type from attrition to maneuver once again?
Well, it's possible. But as you say, the thing is that the Russians no longer have the number of tanks that would make this a probability. And also, of course, drones have radically reduced the importance of, and the sheer capability of tanks on the battlefield. Tanks have become extremely vulnerable. So I think there must be grave doubts over this. Now, I've assumed and also been told by Russian sources that if Russia could conquer the whole of the Donbass, that could be an opportunity for Putin to declare victory. Because going further than that means trying to capture really big urban areas. And we've seen in so many different places, not just in the former Soviet Union, but around the world, how very difficult and costly
Doesn't that also count for like cities like Slavyansk and Kramatorsk?
They're much smaller. Here you're talking about cities of 50,000 people, 100,000 people. Zaporizhia is a city of 800,000 people. Kharkov is a city of more than 2 million people. When you think about the Russian capture of Mariupol at the beginning of the war, that took months. And of course, in the process, the city was completely destroyed. So, and then if you're talking about Kherson, that requires getting across the Dnieper River.
An amphibious assault.
And it's very, unless the Ukrainian army just collapses completely, it's very hard to see that, that is within Russia's capability. And so, I mean, if Russia could get the whole of the Donbass through negotiation, I doubt, Putin is not a military man. If he had been a military man, Russia might very well not have, experienced this disaster. But he's not. I don't think that he is focused on military glory in this sense. If, as I say, but he does need what he can present as a victory. And he is, after all, a quasi-dictator. He does control the mass media, not the social media, but television and so forth. If he can get enough, he can present this to the Russian people as a victory. And if you look at the opinion polls, just as in Ukraine now, according to Gallup, a large majority of Ukrainians would like peace now, even if it means giving up the hope of recovering the lost territories and perhaps giving up the hope of NATO membership. So the opinion polls show that a majority of Russians would like peace now, even if it means giving up the ambition to capture Kherson and Odessa and so on. So I think that it is within Putin's capacity to face down his hardliners and reach a deal. If, obviously, if the terms of a deal are enough for him, in terms of territory, in terms of NATO membership, above all.
From a more political question, Donald Trump made claims during his election campaign where he was claiming that he's going to finish this war in one day, but obviously it didn't come to reality. And now, after certain weeks of negotiations that continued between the United States and Russia, we have seen that certain attacks happened, especially long-distance hits, strategic hits in important cities like Kiev, which infuriated Donald Trump and caused him to get into some sort of social media fight with Medvedev. And then it turned into the nuclear submarines being sent, and it turned into United States putting tariffs on India for buying Russian energy. So we are now, by today, we are seeing discussions continue once again, this time for a permanent peace deal. So there's a lot of ambiguity continuing. What was Trump's aim by sending the nuclear submarines, putting the extra tariffs on India? What is the cause for this?
I think this is absolutely classic Trump. You make a melodramatic move. You look very tough. This whole moving of the submarines was a completely empty gesture. America has nuclear submarines permanently at sea targeting Russia. I mean, moving them, it doesn't mean anything. And any more, by the way, than Medvedev's statement meant anything. He's not the president. He has no real authority in Russia. He's a blowhard. He's allowed to be a blowhard by Putin, but that doesn't mean he represents Putin. So I think, classic Trump. You bluster, you threaten, and then you try to do a deal. Now, the question is, though, we saw that with North Korea in Trump's first term, and then it collapsed because Trump did not have the concrete proposals. He was not prepared or possibly even knowledgeable enough to do a detailed deal with the North Koreans. Could that be the case now with Putin? I hope not. And I think the stakes here for Trump are so high that I hope he will have taken really good professional advice on what he needs to offer. But another point here is that, Trump has declared these impending, hasn't been imposed yet, secondary sanctions against India over Russian oil. Now, a large part of the US security establishment is desperate to get out of this, because India has been absolutely central to the whole of US strategy in Asia when it comes to containing China. Indians also, by the way, have an important political lobby within America now. This threat of tariffs has infuriated Indian public opinion and the Indian government. It's deeply embarrassed Modi, who has portrayed himself as a close friend of Trump. And it risks doing really deep and enduring damage if these sanctions go ahead to the Indian economy and therefore to the US-Indian relationship. So, I think you've got a lot of people saying now, look, we need a deal in Ukraine so that we don't have to impose these sanctions on India. I think that's an important point.
Okay. One final question on Ukraine situation. So obviously Europe is not exactly on the same page with the United States when it comes to Ukraine, and maybe some of the European countries do not mind continuing the war by their own support. But in a case where United States and Russia are not able to get into a peace deal, and United States completely withdraws from all kinds of negotiations and also the military aid as well. Do you think Europe is capable of handling this war by itself?
No. I mean, in principle, yes, if you look at the overall size of the European economies. But if you look at the pressure on European budgets from a combination of economic stagnation, the costs of European rearmament, and the need, to maintain social welfare spending, no, they're not. And of course, the key point is that all the existing European governments and establishments are looking over their shoulder at the populist challenge from the right and the left. And clearly, when you get into a business of severely cutting health services, pensions, social welfare in order to help Ukraine, you will be in a situation in which you are virtually ensuring a victory for the radicals down the line. And in the end, I think the European establishments will opt for political self-preservation. And that's also why I think that if Trump is willing to threaten this in order to get them to agree to a Ukraine peace deal, which they will hate, of course, but I think they will have no choice but to fall in line.